Hello there. So my topic was student-centered or personalized learning through blended learning. The article that I chose is actually from 2016 from a professor out of the University of Rhode Island. And the title of the article is Let's Get Personal, Balancing Talk with Technology to Truly Personalize Learning. There were a couple of reasons why I chose this article and why I want to share some of the information. The main reason is I think that in the introduction, what the author talks about directly relates to our conversations at JT, especially when we look at all the professional development we had with JT Learn and the different tools that are available to us because of being a one-to-one district. And that first major point in his introduction was that giving students technology does not guarantee learning. And that's been a common conversation at JT and us looking at, okay, so technology is a tool that the teacher can use to enhance learning, to capitalize learning, to give students opportunities in learning. But the tool does not replace the teacher. It does not replace the student. And the author delves into that even more when he talks about personalized versus personal approaches. So the author argues that personalization is a top-down style of learning, that this is how a lot of districts argue that they differentiate curriculum. It's still teacher-controlled. Students are allowed to work at their own pace, but they do not have a lot of choice. And then they also have limited interaction with other people. So when I think of this personalization, I think of some of the programs that they use maybe in lower levels. The one program being that I have a really young daughter that kind of comes to mind is this ABC Mouse. So ABC Mouse is a program that students can use following a sequence, but it's still teacher controlled or parent controlled in the sense where I'm going to pick the activity. I'm going to pick what time you're doing it. You're interacting with a computer, and if I'm not there with you, helping you, assisting you, you're not advancing. It's not really enhancing learning. And what he's arguing is that that hasn't been extremely successful in students actually acquiring knowledge. The personalized approach, which is very different. And it's different because in this approach, the learner initiates and controls the learning process. And I'm forgetting the actual term that you use, but I kind of look at this as the golden hour. And I know that there are some teachers, at least in Joliet West, that have practiced this idea where once a week, the students get to investigate and explore a topic of their interest, no matter what that topic may be. And through that exploration, they're doing research. They're writing their annotated bits. They're writing a paper at the end. So it all kind of comes into this end goal of that you could call it a research paper or an argumentative paper or even a narrative, whatever you would like it to be at the end goal. But the students are initiating it through questions, and then they're researching to answer those questions. So it's all about that the learner has control. Through the personal approach, the student is required to engage with other students and teachers. And I think that we can see this happen frequently through any form of feedback as well as through peer editing. And again, it goes back to this idea that the student asks the questions and then problem solves the question. So in a science classroom, it could be something to do with the environment or with technology. In English, you're looking at that research question and kind of how those different things apply. Maybe in math, you're going to apply it more to a proof in geometry or whatever you can find. And I know that teachers do that, not on an everyday basis, but for example, every Friday, we're dedicating time to your question, and it's individual. So as the article continues, the author talks about how technology is the pathway to unlimited information. And I definitely believe that that directly applies to blended learning, because looking back at the introduction from our book, you know, they argue how in the early 1900s, with all the industry happening, 17% of the workforce needed to have those knowledge jobs. So answering those questions, being those problem solvers, only 17%. Whereas today with our economy, we're looking at least 60% of our students need to have knowledge, actual knowledge. And if they don't know the answer, they need to know how to find the answer. And technology is the key to that. So there needs to be a balance between technology and person-to-person interactions, which I think directly relates to the goal of blended learning as presented at JT, because students still have to come into class a couple days a week, whether it be because it's mandated because of grades, because you're going to have, smaller groups and more personalized instruction or opportunities individually for better peer editing, whatever you choose to do with it. But they still are getting that student-to-student face-to-face with the teacher time. And then the article actually gives 4 different ways that you can use instructional practices to try to bring this balance into the technology. So the first one is, obviously, number 1, student choice. Students explore their own meaningful topics. So they choose their topics, and then as a teacher in blended learning, your role is really to educate students on tools, texts, and how to utilize people to their advantage to find their answers and also to better their presentation. So then the second part is he talks about discussion, meaning just because it's technology or blended learning, the discussion piece is crucial. I really like this down here that he talks about students need to have online community conversations, especially think about in their future how email, or if they're going to have a system like Link or anything like that. I mean, my mom and her business uses Skype, so maybe Skype. How are you going to control those online, but as well as face-to-face, because you still have meetings. And then he talks about you still have to teach them how to argue and negotiate and their presentation skills, because all of these come into the professional world. This is a part of being a professional in the modern economy for the United States, because you are consistently doing some sort of deal making, whether or not you realize it's what you're doing. But you need to learn, you need to know how to set out your argument and set out your information and organize your thoughts, as well as how to negotiate or compromise, and also how to present that information clearly. Occasionally we will watch Shark Tank, and there are so many people who have fantastic ideas, but their presentation is awful. And because of the low presentation skill, they actually get less money for their idea than they should, all because they don't know how to articulate their idea correctly. The third step, which we've talked about with our SAMR model kind of being towards the end of that, is this idea of creation. That students need to be creating with technology, not receiving. So it shouldn't be computer dictated or computer generated. The students need to create it. So again, this just reinforces this presentation, negotiation, and argumentation aspect. And then lastly, participation. So if you can do 1 and 2 and 3, you're going to get students' participation because you're going to give them ownership of what they're learning. And they're going to be active participants in their own learning. And then in the conclusion, he just reiterates all of these points, coming back to students need a voice and the opportunity to explore what they love the most. And this goes back to this idea of we're mentors, we're facilitators in a blended learning environment, and how can we make that work? So while I think that some aspects of this you're not going to use every day, at least not the final product. So I think for me, looking at this article and the goals of it and trying to stay student-centered and personalized for students in blended learning is, what are the steps in between? How are we going to get from this point A to that final product of creating and presenting and arguing? What are we going to do in between? If you want to call those formative assessments along the way, how are we going to make that successful? And what is that going to look like?